So today we are going to be hearing from Dr. Hayley Sneed. Hayley works at CYCJ now in our participation team, where she's working along a number of different projects, seeking to provide opportunities for children and young people to influence the shape and direction of youth justice going forward. She does have a PhD from the University of Glasgow, and she's going to be presenting some of her findings from that. Now, you can read more about Hayley on the CYCJ website, and I'll have links to her work will be embedded in the chat later on. So Hayley, I'll just pass over to you. Good luck, and I'll speak to you at the very end of the presentation. Thanks.
Fab, thanks Ross, and thanks Sally for managing all the tech and the chat. So I'm just going to share my slides and then we'll get started. Right, can we see?
Yep, all good at this end, Hayley.
Fab. So thanks everybody for joining today. So I'm Dr. Hayley Sneed, and the session really kind of draws directly on my doctoral research, like Ross said, but I think it's not, a presentation about, the thesis as an academic object necessarily. It's about what young people really told me about their lives, about well-being, about care, and about constraint, and kind of what those insights ask of kind of care and youth justice systems in Scotland. And, to be clear kind of from the outset, to set up kind of what the research was, it wasn't designed to kind of evaluate particular services or measure outcomes, but it was designed to really understand how well-being and systems are experienced and how kind of care and constraint kind of coexist in young people's everyday lives. So over the next, 35, 40 minutes or so, I'll kind of share young people's words and kind of the reflections from the participatory study I did, and we'll kind of keep returning to kind of a central thought or question. So if we kind of really listen to young people's experiences of harm, of care, and of participation, how should our care and justice systems respond differently? So I'm deliberately kind of holding that last bit of this for questions and discussion. Ideally, it would be nice to have, an outward discussion, but I think logistically, with as many people as there is, it's not going to happen today. So please feel free to put stuff in the chat. And if there's stuff that we don't get to, or people have further questions, I think Sally's going to drop in the CYCJ email, and you can contact that, and we can kind of field any discussions or questions off the back of that. And I think this is really important. Kind of the implications of this work is really important, and they don't really sit neatly, and I don't think that they should sit neatly. And so that's why I think having that ability to have that discussion beyond this kind of moment in time is really important. So no particular content notes of sorts. I think I did put on the website, we'll be going to, talk about poverty, about stigma, about mental health challenges, and kind of children's experiences of, systems that feel controlling or frustrating, but there's no, graphic detail. And yeah, so let's get into it. So the first part, I'm going to be talking about the context and the approach to the research. And then we're going to move through kind of the core insights and the three kind of main findings from the research, and then bring them together kind of into conversation to talk about kind of what they mean for youth justice and for, care as well. So youth justice kind of in Scotland increasingly recognises that, children's lives are kind of shaped by context, whether that's by family circumstances, by poverty, by housing, trauma, as well as, structural inequality. So that work is very important, and many of you in the room are deeply committed to it, just like we are at CYCJ. So kind of the starting point for my research wasn't necessarily this idea that, nothing happens until a young person either offends or comes in contact with the care or justice system. The young people that I worked with were not necessarily unknown to systems. They had experiences experience various forms of, support, of intervention, as well as care over time. And what the research kind of highlights is not necessarily the absence of care or intervention, but kind of the persistence of harm alongside care and intervention. And that's kind of where we're going to be focusing today. So young people were navigating relationships, with professionals, with different services. And again, they were still living in these environments marked by instability as well as stigma and disinvestment in their local communities. And so really looking at the question of, what are the limits of what, systems can achieve, even when people and practitioners are really trying to support these young people, when these, the structural conditions around these young people that are shaping young people's lives remain largely unchanged. And I think that question is highly relevant for youth justice and kind of what we're going to be considering today. So the study itself was a qualitative participatory study. So it was situated within a Scottish youth work setting after COVID, and it involved multiple methods over a long period of time, so about 8 months. So we used visual methods like photovoice, which is a method where the young people go out into their local community. They take photos of things that kind of matter to them around their well-being, around care, around constraint. We then brought those back, or the young people brought them back kind of into a group setting where we use kind of group dialogue to discuss these, to unpack these, to give the young people a chance to kind of explore the photos that they took. We also did some individual reflective interviews, or I said we, with each of the young people. And then we, together as a group, myself and the young people, created a public exhibition, and they kind of decided all of the different bits. So, they weren't just involved in sharing their views. They took photographs of their lives. They kind of identified and analyzed different patterns together. They named and decided, kind of what mattered within the data. They chose kind of what messages they wanted adults and the decision makers in their local community to hear, and how kind of their work would be presented publicly within the exhibition. So I think it's also important to kind of be careful about what the research claims as well. So this isn't a study, designed to generalize across all young people or predict big outcomes, but its strengths lie in kind of the depth that this research went into. And the triangulation of the data that we did, and kind of the really participatory and ethical engagement that happened throughout the study. And I think, for youth justice, that depth really matters because, often the systems that we work in succeed or fail, kind of not necessarily through policy intent, but often through how they are lived and experienced by young people every day, in their day-to-day lives. So I had 6 young people aged 12 to 16 that participated over an 8-month period. And then we had 14 stakeholders that were asked at the public exhibition, kind of about their experiences, what they took from the young people's data, what their views were, and kind of what they felt most called to in terms of action, because that's what the young people were really interested in as well, is, how are you going to help us with your power in your local communities, kind of help address some of these things that impact us on a day-to-day basis. So rather than starting this kind of project with an adult or kind of policy definition of well-being, I asked young people kind of what well-being meant to them. And together they came up with a simple but quite powerful, framework or definition. And well-being to them meant being comfortable, being healthy, and being happy. And for me, as a researcher, as an academic, as well as a youth worker and a community development, worker, is what's missing from this. So there's really no emphasis on positivity. There's no emphasis on coping skills or individual resilience, and well-being here wasn't framed as something that like the young people do internally. It was framed as something that was made possible, or as you might see in some of the findings, impossible by kind of the external conditions around them. And that's what they really were focusing on. And feeling well to them meant feeling safe or being treated with respect, having relationships that lasted, and kind of living environments that didn't constantly, undermine their feeling of self-worth. And this really matters to youth justice because, it challenges those kind of individualized approaches to that locate kind of distress or difficulty primarily inside the young person, rather than kind of asking whether their lives are structured in ways that make well-being kind of realistically attainable. And that was something that was quite, I think, profound for me, that came out of this research. So this slide is kind of about, we're moving into maybe some meaning making here and some of the findings. So the young people spoke extensively about kind of their physical environments. They spoke about litter, broken housing, unsafe parks and communities, boarded up shops. And, these weren't generally described as issues that no one had ever noticed. In many cases, young people were very aware that, some of the adults in their community cared and that concerns had been raised. But really what came out of this was this powerlessness, that knowing that kind of these problems have been recognized, but also knowing that little kind of materially kind of changes. And this creates a particular kind of frustration and fatigue amongst these young people. For example, we have a few quotes here that you can see on the page that are quite poignant. It's like we're invisible to the people who could make a difference. Coco said, everywhere you look, it's just grey and falling apart. And Rosie said, it makes you feel worthless. So young people weren't just describing these poor environments, they were interpreting them. These spaces and these broken housing and the litter were all kind of read as messages about value and worth, from where they came from. So, and it's, I think, important to say that these interpretations didn't necessarily come from out of the blue either. They were often reinforced by how young people kind of experienced being treated, whether that was in school or in services and public spaces. And this is where I think well-being becomes particularly and very clearly political. So if environments, communicate who or what is valued and who or what isn't, then I feel, that care and justice systems kind of operating within those environments inherit that meaning unless they actively try to kind of counter that. And that is kind of something that came from the young people as well, was this underlying feeling and idea that not only do they feel these things kind of imposed on them, but also the services that they interact with as well. And, one thing that came through very strongly in the data is that well-being was experienced as relational before anything else. So young people talked about well-being in terms of how they were seen, how they were treated, and whether relationships felt safe enough to be honest within. So the quotes on this slide are particularly important. So Lauren said, if I didn't have this space, I'd still be getting lifted. Here they listen. And here Lauren's talking about her local youth project. So Lauren said, when you get into bother, everyone stops seeing who you are and just sees what you've done. And again, these are particularly important because, they capture something that I think we see again and again across these justice contexts, the shift from being known as this whole person to being kind of reduced to a label or a behavior, an action, a particular incident, or, as labeled as this, risk. And kind of amid all of this, the young people were very clear that relationships mattered enormously. Young people described, trusted adults, often youth workers, but also others, as kind of the difference between being managed as well as being understood. So there was a big, the people that they felt like were trusted adults made them feel understood rather than being felt managed. So, they weren't describing here either. I think it's important to say, a desire to avoid accountability in terms of maybe they're offending or, particular risk that they might be or behavior that they might be exhibiting. It was really a desire to kind of be held in relationship rather than kind of managed at a distance. They really wanted someone to understand them and be close to them and be trusted to be able to work through those things. Rather than oftentimes what they had experienced is, this kind of quite distant relationship in which they don't really have trust or respect built up with. So in our line of work, relational well-being is, I would like to think, prioritized and understood, but in other spaces it's not, and it's seen as kind of being soft or kind of incidental maybe. But it really is the condition under which young people felt honesty, reflection, and kind of responsibility became possible, really, when they talked about, things that, were happening in their lives. Young people were also very strategic and reflective about when kind of they spoke and when they didn't. So silence oftentimes was not a lack of insight on particular subjects or issues. It was often kind of a form of, self-protection. So feeling kind of emotionally safe didn't necessarily mean feeling unchallenged. It kind of meant for them knowing that kind of what you shared wouldn't immediately be turned into surveillance or punishment or a loss of control of the information that they just gave to the adult. And, this has very direct kind of implications for youth justice, where information sharing and risk management and procedural responsibilities, shape all of our interactions with young people. And Lalo said here, I only talk if I trust you. And that is such kind of a quite a, direct and poignant quote. So the data really, I think, invites us to ask, how do we as practitioners create spaces and conditions where kind of honesty is possible? And it isn't risky for a young person to be honest and to divulge their information and be comfortable. And, this aligns kind of closely, I think, what we already know within care and, youth justice is relationships, don't necessarily, they don't sit alongside intervention. They often are the intervention. And this study, I feel, makes visible how much emotional labor those relationships require, often within systems, that struggle to kind of protect this relational continuity and depth due to funding and and whatnot. So when the young people spoke to the local stakeholders that came to their exhibition, this really came out of that data, how they do care deeply and they do have these relationships, but on the other side of it, kind of something that the young people learned, as well as was made more clear to myself through this research, was that there is a lot of emotional labor that goes into this, and the structural support is very limited. And so for this, kind of drawing on a feminist ethics of care, the study highlights that it's not just, or it's not just, it is not a professional failure, but really it's a systemic issue in terms of being able to sustain these relational, this relational care within the work that we do. And, it's very important to say that, we know that care is happening often intensely, it's happening creatively, and it is happening. But it's being practiced within structures that kind of limit what care can achieve. And, when systems rely on individual goodwill, which happens quite often, in third sector places, in care, in, youth justice, ultimately, they survive by exhausting kind of the most caring people within them. So both practitioners and young people alike, so particularly for youth justice, where expectations of care, of accountability and risk management kind of intersect and come into conversation with one another, this has very serious implications. And we have to kind of, I believe, make that a bigger focus. And, participation was one of the most kind of complex aspects of this study. So the young people valued greatly having a space in which they could speak and reflect on things like their well-being. And many described kind of growing confidence with reflecting on things in their life, as well as this, they developed this critical awareness of kind of the systems around them. For example, here Lee said, we talked about what needed to change, but nothing happened. So oftentimes, participation felt empowering when it led to action, but it also felt damaging when it didn't. When their input wasn't followed by this visible change, it felt very extractive. And I feel one of the contributions, this research made by the young people is kind of naming participation as conditional. Its effects depend on power, it depends on follow through, and the material change that the young people can see. And I think that this is particularly relevant for care and justice, participation work, advisory groups, as well as kind of lived experience involvement, that there is, again, just as there's, emotional risk and emotional labor in the work we do as practitioners, for, children and young people that are involved in any sort of participatory work, advisory group, or even, telling their story to a new social worker or telling their story to a new, somebody that they haven't met before is a big risk. And making sure that kind of we center that the ability to be able to do something kind of with that is really, really important. So kind of bringing the findings together conceptually, and rethinking well-being as relational, as structural, as well as political. So, young people's experiences kind of challenge these narrow or these individualized models of well-being. And their accounts kind of consistently pointed to well-being as something that is produced or constrained through relationships, through resources, and through recognition. So they kind of connected feeling well to being seen, being respected, and kind of cared for in places that are stable and are safe. And where those conditions were missing, where spaces were crumbling, where adults came and went, and kind of well-being became very, very fragile for these young people. So when, I say that well-being is like relational, I mean, it grows through that trust and connection that we have with children and young people. When it's, structural, it relies on resources and funding and safety and stability being built into communities. And when I say it's political, meaning, that who gets care and whose voices count are questions of power and not just service design. And, it means acknowledging that kind of decisions about funding, about space, about continuity, as well as participation shape kind of who gets to feel safe and who feels valued and who feels hopeful or who feels well. So I think this reframing is quite crucial. And it shifts well-being kind of from an outcome that we measure to a condition that we can design and that should be designed. That is what young people are telling us. That it isn't just an individual, this individual responsibility, but something bigger and something wider. Young people, didn't ask for more programs, they didn't ask for anything fancy. They asked for, adults who stayed and remained consistent in their lives. They asked for environments in which they felt safe and they felt cared for by the people around them. And they asked for their participation to lead somewhere tangible. And the issue here, I think, and not a surprise probably maybe to any of us, but is structural. Relational practice really cannot kind of be sustained on this goodwill alone. And I feel, if care and justice systems value this care, it must be funded and it must be protected and it must be stabilized. Um, you know, and all of these things have to, the conditions that make well-being and good, positive well-being, healthy well-being, comfortable well-being for these young people. And I suppose before opening things up, I think maybe only half an hour instead of 40 or 45 minutes, but I suppose holding maybe some of these questions, and if you're comfortable bringing them into the chat as well. I try to not have particularly abstract questions, but practical, kind of maybe uncomfortable and slightly political questions. Maybe holding the one that kind of maybe resonates the most with you. And yeah, I'm just really interested to see kind of how this lands across different roles and contexts, what feels the most challenging or the most possible, I suppose, from where you sit. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hayley. That was excellent and really a really good starting point to get us chatting about well-being of children in particular. And I'm going to jump to the chat because we've got two questions, and Marissa has stolen the question I had in mind, and I'll just read it to you. I think it's interesting when you consider this reframing of well-being, pointing out that certain aspects of GIRFIC and their well-being indicators Shinari. So for anybody not from Scotland, we have a policy called Getting It Right for Every Child, also known as GIRFIC. Within that, we have wellbeing indicators of Shinari. We're going to have a little test later on to see if everybody who can remember what they all stand for. But basically, Marissa and I are wanting to ask, do you think there's a way to ask about Shinari that gives the kids the ability to choose what they focus on in social work? So I will have, as my time as being a social worker, I will have referred to the Shinari indicators numerous times, but that really was quite different to what the not completely different, but quite different to what the children were referring to there. So your thoughts on that?
I think there's absolutely, a way to ask about Shinari that gives kind of the young people maybe the ability to kind of choose what they focus on. I suppose, thinking about this research, what's transferable isn't, the photo voice necessarily itself, but I suppose the principles behind it, using concrete prompts to shift conversation. So in my study, images helped young people kind of speak more freely and on their own terms. And in practice, I suppose it might be as simple as asking, a young person to show or describe something that represents how they feel for them, rather than kind of relying only on this kind of direct questioning. I suppose, the obviously GIRFIC and Shinari absolutely have a place. It's how do we, I don't necessarily have the answer, but how do we, I suppose, in this particular instance, what young people were telling us, how do we kind of bring those two into conversation with themselves? How do we kind of make the Shinari, I suppose, a bit more participatory in and of itself, and I suppose bringing them into the conversation instead of kind of explain what Shinari is, explain what those aspects are, what do they think is most relevant to them. Having that kind of clarity and honesty and kind of it was really important to these young people, and they were far more comfortable sharing when they understood kind of the implications, I suppose, of what they were being asked. And yeah, I think having, creating maybe some small pockets of that reflective space as well. So even briefly, where, the purpose isn't that immediate assessment or kind of maybe decision making, but young people kind of described how rare that was for them to have resourced specific time that wasn't instantly tied to particular outcomes or consequences. And I feel like having that really mattered as well. So building that into, I don't know, how we use kind of those well-being indicators as well.
Thank you. In the chat, suggestion from Caitlin and from Marissa, the Wellbeing Web, which has been used certainly in my time as a social worker, as a way of getting the kids to sit down and for them to chart how safe they felt, how healthy they felt, achieving, nurtured, active, respected, responsible, and included is the I. Okay, we're going to skip to a question from Caroline, who is from the very south of the United Kingdom. Caroline is asking, I really appreciate the point that young people want adults who remain and who are consistent. Hayley, going into the issue around about service design and quite political here, but how do we design services that retain staff in the political and economic climate that we're in? If you'd answer that question in 10 words or less, that'd be great. A simple question for you.
Funding, 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 funding.
Yeah.
No, but funding. But also, I think like we have to, I think, build into the work to take care of our workers, you know. I know we can't do that without funding. I feel like it's the easiest answer, isn't it? Like, our the whole system, of kind of work is not necessarily designed to take care of us as workers. But I think we have to, in order to, retain staff, we have to have the funding to pay staff. But also in terms of, I suppose, the kind of like emotional labor that I discussed within the work that we do, that needs to be, I think, sustained. And how do we, in order to sustain the kind of workers that are giving so much and this emotional labor is so high, I think it needs to be built into kind of, service design. Otherwise, I think we see, youth workers, we see teachers, we see social workers kind of burnout, things like that. And I think it's similar to, I suppose, a similar model to what we described here is, this well-being model, not only for young people, but moving away from this individualized sense of well-being, for professionals as well. And that it's not just on us to have this individual resilience, or kind of we need to be more positively minded, or we need to, yes, self-care is important, but if we can build those things systemically into our services, where we're addressing the political and we're addressing the structural and the relational to address our own well-being, as well as maybe the children and young people that we work with, is, in a perfect world, I suppose, how I would maybe go about it.
Okay, thank you, Hayley. Right. The question I had is, can you tell us a bit more about the methodology, and the methods rather, that you used? You use photo voice, you use other creative ways. And I was wondering, tell a little bit more about that. And then I know that we've got social workers and other youth workers on the call, so maybe about how they might be able to use it with the children and young people that they come into contact with.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll just talk a bit more, I think, about, like you said, the methods first, and then maybe how we might transfer those. So, photo voice is a kind of visual, creative, participatory method. I explained very briefly. The young people went out in their community and they took photos of kind of, what mattered to them. They came up with some prompts before they went out, kind of like what's positive for their well-being, what's negative for their well-being, things of that nature. And it's free reign. They can take pictures of whatever they want pertaining to kind of the topics that they wanted to explore. And then, really the focus is bringing them back into conversation. So you bring those photos in and you use them, to kind of, something that how you describe them is called the showed method. And it's like, what do we see here? If we just look at it. what's actually happening here, because we can see the same picture but maybe take different things from it. And ultimately what this leads to is, now what can we do about it? So that is what photo voice is really kind of. Not only is it a method to explore, but it is built in to start asking critical questions about how we can take action. What can we do to try to change things? So that action is more built into the method itself, which I think is quite, special. So that was kind of the main creative method I used. I also used some photo elicitation as well. So photo elicitation was used similarly, but instead of the young people taking photos, they gave me themes. So after we'd done the sessions where they took their own photos and brought them to the discussion, I asked them, was there anything that they, hadn't discussed that they wanted to discuss in terms of the well-being that didn't come up? Was there things that they wanted to keep discussing? And so based on those kind of themes that they gave me, I went away and brought photos in for another session, and to kind of do the same process, and to as topics of discussion. What does this mean for you? Because again, we can have the same photo, but Ross and I can kind of interpret them totally differently if we're asked the question of how might this impact our well-being. So those were kind of the two creative methods, and that led to the kind of photo exhibition, the public exhibition. Now, in terms of kind of translating these, I think it's a really good question. And I want to be clear that I'm not necessarily suggesting that social workers take on an entire research project or add, particular bits of extra work like that. But I suppose what's transferable isn't, I think I maybe spoke about this a little bit before, isn't just the photo voice itself, but again, the principles behind it. So using concrete prompts to shift conversations. Again, the images really allowed the young people to kind of speak a bit more freely on their own terms, and describe things in a different way rather than just kind of written text, or writing down what they might think or feel, or say what they might think or feel. So in practice that might mean just kind of asking a young person to show or describe something kind of that represents how things feel for them, how they're experienced things, rather than kind of relying on that only on direct questioning. So you can also use photo elicitation this way as well. How what does this bring up for you in relation to what we're talking about? Again, kind of what the methods allowed, I think, the young people really to do was creating those small pockets of reflective space. So with one thing that came out is, when we're talking about the systemic nature around youth work and funding, and how difficult it is to sustain kind of these long-term relational aspects of their work, they didn't often have time for, a really in-depth reflective space like this, because they're always kind of in firefighting mode. And so that's one thing that the young people really, really appreciated, was having a resourced, time-bound space where, the purpose isn't, again, that immediate assessment or decision making. It was very rare for them to have that time that they could just think about things. They could reflect in a creative way, using the photographs, or for example in other projects, using zine making, or collage, or just getting Lego, doing something else with them. And that kind of shift mattered a lot. And then again, I mentioned it was throughout the honesty and the transparency, and young people are, far more comfortable when they feel understood. And as well, when they understood the parameters maybe of a conversation, what could and couldn't changed, or how what they said might be used, being explicit about limits, about follow through. And I think a lot of I would like to hope, a lot of people that are trauma informed and have that contextual safeguarding knowledge would do this already, but that's how I would say is kind of transferring these things into everyday practice outside of trying to do a research project, I suppose, or a full creative participatory project, if that's not, within your wheelhouse or your remit.
Yeah, I think going back to my own experience, I think most social workers would be really interested in doing that, but I think they would perhaps be a bit nervous about introducing that into their toolkit without the support and the supervision that comes along with that they might require. But I
Yeah,
certainly think there's benefit of it. And they can, obviously, the social workers can get back in touch with you, Hayley, to have a chat about it and how they can incorporate it with
absolutely.
their practice. Okay, we're going to be going to a question from Caroline and Inverclyde shortly, but before I do so, because I know that people will be starting to head off, Sally is going to drop a link in the chat to tell us about some of our forthcoming webinars. We have one coming up regarding understanding justice and equalities, and that is just a couple of weeks' time, and there's an opportunity to contribute towards that piece of research. Later on in May, we're going to be talking about the 2025 Secure Care Census and what changing profiles we've seen amongst the secure care population. And then at the end of May, we've got a webinar with our director and Professor Cedric Foussard, who's going to be talking about the child-centred justice and how that the shift in paradigm is required for all nations to approach, undertake and deliver rights respecting justice. So all of that is free to attend. Please click on the link there and you'll be able to both sign up to our newsletter and see our forthcoming webinars. And just at that point, Sally has thankfully reminded me of our brand new training package, which is entirely free. It's funded very graciously, and we thank very much the Promise Scotland, who have entirely funded this e-learn module regarding rights respecting residential care. It's free for anybody, even out people out with Scotland. I don't mean even, including people from out with Scotland are free and at liberty to undertake this course, and it'll help highlight some of the challenges that residential workers might face in providing a rights respecting place for children to live, the challenges that people within residential care might face in terms of them being over criminalised or unnecessarily criminalised. So please have a click on that and you'll see some of our other free e-learning platform modules which have become really, really highly rated and excellent content, including one about the Care and Justice Act, particularly for those people operating in Scotland. So with only a few minutes left, I'm going to go back to Caroline's question. So Caroline, I know works in Inverclyde, and she writes that in her local authority, they're having a perfect refresh, and I'm sure Hayley would be really excited, Caroline, to chat to you about that. The young people
Yeah.
have so many ideas about how this could be shared wider, so they have a better idea of what this means for them. This is across all ages. Sometimes we cut up in the things that we don't have, and the things we don't have, and forget the basics, including relationships-based practice. Stickability is what our young people always speak about. Not sure if you guys agree. Well, I certainly agree, and I'm certainly Hayley agrees, but she's going to expand on that a little bit further. Hayley.
Yeah, so I think, it resonates strongly with what the young people shared in my research. A lot of time the frustration wasn't that adults, weren't trying, but the young people didn't really understand, like they don't know what GERFIC actually means for them in practice. So, the idea, I suppose, of widening how it's communicated, in young people's terms across age ranges feels really important. And you're definitely right about kind of the basics there. So young people consistently spoke about the importance of being asked, being listened to, having someone who stayed. But again, the aspect of, okay, well, now that you've asked and we've been listened to, what's actually happened to all of the things we've told you? The stickability kind of came up again and again, not seeing something, as something like technical or resource heavy, but consistency, trust, knowing a relationship wouldn't disappear when things got difficult. And, you know, um, yeah, so I think, as a reminder, relationship based practice is often where that meaning, and that safety and that understanding are built. So, yeah, I think it's like how the challenges is like how do we protect and value that relational work within the systems that we work in are under pressure, and then kind of rather than losing sight of it while trying to fix what's missing. And I think I saw a comment there as well, about how do we maintain these relationships after a project is completed while maintaining kind of those professional boundaries. And I think it's a really important part of this conversation because, young people talked about as well that, relationships ending abruptly or once a role or, a service had formally finished, and how hard that could feel, especially when they are being really vulnerable and talking about their lives and the really terrible things that that has happened to them, or the really happy things that have happened to them. So that is that was really hard. And I think at the same time, I don't necessarily think the answer is kind of blurred or informal involvement without thought. So I think what young people seem to value most was the choice and the clarity and consistency of a relationship. So knowing what would happen, having some sort of say in it, and not feeling kind of dropped because the system had just stopped or the service had just stopped. So again, um, you know, we need to create spaces or systems in which we can, that is safe to kind of continue a relationship that kind of feels less about that individual goodwill and more about kind of them being, I suppose, honest and intentional about endings, about transitions, whether it's safe to keep a relationship on, appropriate ways of maintaining that connection. And I think just like it needs to be addressed head on, because I think it is such a, we see that as well, like in the groups that we work with, that some young people really want to continue doing something. So how, trying to create and resource spaces where young people can then, still either come together as a group and we are there as practitioners as well, or, trying to keep up that relationship in an appropriate way. It's I think a difficult one, but I think a really important one.
Well, I suppose I'll take advantage of my position as chair and ask another question, Hayley. Two questions.
Too.
Two questions. The first one being, this was a very qualitative piece of work. What do
Uh-huh.
you think a quantitative researcher would say about this, and what was your response to be to that? I suppose that was two questions. And the third question I'm going to chuck in then, we're a month away from the Scottish general elections. What do you think
Mm.
the participants in your study or your groups that you work with would say to the politicians who are looking to be elected?
You didn't ask easy questions, Ross. The first one is about quantitative, what a quantitative researcher would say. So I think some quantitative researchers would say like, oh, great, but so what? Kind of thing. For example, I had like at a conference maybe last year, I presented my research and he was really, really stuck on that I only had 6 participants. He was like, well, what about, how do you kind of translate these findings into kind of for young people across Scotland or young people across the UK or young people in the Netherlands? And I was like, I think the answer really is that it doesn't necessarily. My argument here, I suppose, is like that qualitative work doesn't have a responsibility to be generalizable. What I think it does show, though, is the depth and using that triangulation of the data and kind of valuing lived experience as valid forms of knowledge. And that is what I think, comes out of this primarily. So that is kind of what I think quantitative people or researchers would generally say, oh, well, this isn't generalizable, or what does this mean for young people across Scotland? This particularly, doesn't have to mean anything for young people across Scotland. But what it does do is, I think, help us ask more questions. And kind of validate the young people that did participate over a very long period of time, kind of what they experienced and what their thoughts were, and kind of recognize those as valid, valid knowledge and experience, in this particular topic. So that's what I would say in terms of that. Um, Yeah, like I think it doesn't have like that's pretty much I got that from one of my supervisors. She's like, you don't have a responsibility to be generalizable as long as you're not saying that you're generalizable. To, as long as you're being honest about your positionality of what you're doing and who it applies to, and being clear about that, and then you don't have it's different. We could get into a whole positionality and ontological and epistemological debate if you wanted to on what we feel, what our worldview is and what we view as valid knowledge. But yeah, so I think it's an interesting topic, definitely. And the second one was, what do you think the young people would say to
To the
those who
politicians,
are?
to
I
politicians just
think
now.
I think in this particular study, in relation to this particular study and what the young people had to say, I think that they would say to them that I think how much their make it clear to them how much their everyday lives and the community that they are kind of in contact with impacts them. That constraint as everyday harm. I think that that is something that, neglect, instability, stigma, and, poverty are lived and they're ongoing and they happen every single day and in these young people's lives. And that is something that I think they would say. And I think that they would also say, um, especially these young people valued youth workspaces so much. It was a space that they didn't have anywhere else to feel safe and feel comfortable and feel happy. And to have those consistent relationships in their community. I think that that's something that they would say as well. And then lastly, I think they would probably say, if you're going to ask us what we think, like, do something about it. I think one of the quotes, I didn't put it in here, one of the quotes from my research said something like, oh, well, we keep talking to these people. I feel like you turn our words into gold and then just like tell us to fuck off or something like that, is what one of the young people said. And I was like, oh, because there's like consultations at school or in the youth work, sometimes people ask, people to, hey, what do your young people think about this? And but they're like, it doesn't go anywhere. What's the point? So I think that they would say something like that. If you want to get young people involved, make sure that you're getting young people involved meaningfully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to just drive by consultation. We actually got to actually turn that into action off the end of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, I really appreciate everybody coming along and giving up an hour of your time. Hope that's been helpful for your own practice. I'm certain that Hayley and the rest of the participation team would love to hear from you all if you have any projects in mind or want to just keep in touch with what the work that Hayley and our colleagues are undertaking. Hayley, thanks again for talking us through your research. Congratulations. And for
Thank
everybody,
you.
thanks for seeing us, and I'll hopefully see you at a future webinar in the coming weeks. Cheers. Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.